Assalamu alaikum, Ramadan Mubarak. What I want to start off with, brother, is asking your name, where you're from, and your journey to Islam.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Ramadan Mubarak. My name is Ravin. I would leave it at that because the other name is attached to my oppressor. So I would not use that name, A journey to Islam. That's the question. More appropriately, for me personally, in a different context, I would say my journey in Islam. And oh, by the way, I'm from the Caribbean, originally from the Far East. My grandparents from Pakistan, Bangladesh, places like that, and we were brought to the Caribbean by the British in about 1838 or something like that. Maybe they came a little bit after, but that was when the British first started bringing people from the Indian subcontinent into the Caribbean. Specifically, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I have to say that based on the premise that everybody was born Muslim, I have to say that's when my journey in Islam started, because Islam just simply means submission to the will of Allah, and we are all born with that submission. So we'll then learn good and bad and everything else in between. The journey itself is been uphill and downhill and across and beyond and inside and outside and every which way, but I can't explain it any different because you just wouldn't probably understand. And I say this not in any kind of malicious way, that you wouldn't understand what I'm talking about unless you understand your own passage and how you come to be where you are, based on circumstances and environment that had a huge impact in my life as a person. It had a really huge impact. And from a very early age, I would say I was attracted to, or I was inclined to believe differently than my friends and people around me, and my family and my parents. And so I wanted to, the dynamics that was happening at the time, I was struggling to understand as a young child what that was, because I was not fortunate to have academic preference or academic abilities that was possessed by a lot of other people, or I would say academic opportunities that was given to other children based on the environment and the country and the type of and what was happening around that time, you see? So let me put it this way. The time I was born, the country that I come from hadn't received independence from the British as yet. We were still born within the colonial period, even though colonialism itself extended beyond independence. So having been born in a time like, in an environment like that where people see things differently. We didn't have a big house. I actually was born in a little mud hut, actually, with a grass roof. which is known to Trinidadians as a najupa. We lived with my grandmother, and you know, there are things I observed with them as a child growing up, because they called it differently, and I was wondering why we were being taught that we were different, or we were somehow above, or somehow unrelated to the neighbor, for instance. My neighbor was of African descent, and for somehow or the other, we were being taught that we're different than these people. But it dawned on me that the conditions are the same. We all live in the same type of conditions, you know. And why is this important in my journey in Islam? As I said before, I'm going on the premise that we're all born Muslim. So we are in Islam whether we want to be in it or not. Mm-hmm. And Allah guides us whether we want to be guided or not. And we don't have a choice in that matter. It's kind of a choiceless matter. The only thing we have choices in is good and bad and whatever else in between there. And that's just my opinion. You don't have to agree with me or anything of the sort. You know? You could say whatever. That is really irrelevant to me. I never had the opportunity to actually go to school past the age of 13 because we just simply couldn't afford it. Being in a country where there's about 5 schools and there are only placements for 1,000 kids, and you have 20,000 kids sitting right in this entrance examination. Nobody, you know, we didn't have opportunities, you see, to further certain education. So we were being groomed. I grew up in the oil field, and we were being groomed to work in the oil field and to work for overseers and work for foreign oil company that owned the place. And everybody worked there. My grandparents worked there, my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, you know what I'm saying? Well, we all the kids in the village worked there. And we were all expected to, at some point, to go in there. So it's like it's kind of like, because your father worked there, you could get a job there. Mm-hmm. So it's like a never-ending supply of cheap labor for these oil companies. And we were contented with that because we didn't have nothing else to compare it to. We didn't understand what exploitation was. As children, we didn't understand what exploitation. So everything was like natural and normal. It's like a normal set of behaviors. I remember there was like this you know what them sirens are when you have wartime sirens. Where they had one of that in the oil field, and at 7:15, you would hear it. Everybody was based their lives around that thing. You hear it at 7:15 in the morning. At 7, you hear it at 11:45 to break for lunch, and you hear it at 1 o'clock or whenever, and you hear it at 4 when it's done. So you go like, oh, so all the conversation when the whistle blow yet, so you mad, that's what's your clock. And what does that have to do with my journey in Islam? I'm going to keep it right there so for you to get an idea of how the journey was. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in that kind of environment of exploitation and oppression, and where it seemed very normal. People in 1937, while the oil companies were, I wasn't born yet, but stories, I wasn't born much long after that. There was a lot of demonstrations and stuff for workers' rights and equal pay, and that you know what I'm talking about. protesting and demonstrating. So we grew up in that kind of environment all through the 50s when I was born. It still continued all through into the 70s when it made some changes were made culturally. So, but prior to the 1970s period when some of that changed, and we were growing up like normal children, we did normal stuff that kids were doing. Then came 1970. I must fast forward to 1970 because all the rest of the stuff is just irrelevant. So I'm gonna fast forward to 1970. At the age of 14, my father came home one day and asked me if I want to go listen to those Black Power fellas, and that was height of demonstrations in the city. It was a height of demonstration that things were getting destroyed, and a lot of talk and now, Trinidad is a country that half of the population is, relatively half of the population is East Indian. And the other half is African. And the other 10%, maybe 15% is every other people, Europeans and Caucasians and Lebanese, Syrians, Middle Eastern, and Chinese, and so it's a conglomerate of people, So in April of 1970, or actually January of 1970, I remember it was just after Christmas, and my father came home one day and he was saying, you want to go out and hear these brothers talking? I said, well, for me, the conversation was not important. Actually, the conversation about black awareness and brown awareness and Indian African unity and all of that, which was the topic of the conversations that these brothers were having, that was not important to me at the time. What was important to me, however, was I'm going to get to be out on the street. That was the whole idea. I didn't want to, because it didn't make no sense to me. It's like, because I'm coming from a place where I'm thinking all of these things are normal. So to go out and hear somebody talking against that was not the actual thing I had. I was just going to be out on the street and there was going to be a lot of other people there. And so I get out, and we didn't live too far from the place where it was, where they came. It was a little car park. And when we get out there, there's police everywhere, there's soldiers and the army, and it was like, woo, and this holy pajama man. And so, so we out there and we listening. And my cousin was actually supposed to deliver a speech. So I think that's what encouraged my father to go, not necessarily because he wanted to do that. So we went, and we listened to whatever, we did whatever we did. I can't remember in detail what we did. We went back home. But as the years progressed, between 15, April of that same year, the government declared a state of emergency. So it was a dusk to dawn curfew. And seeing that I had already been on the street, going out on the street to hang out, we used to call it liming. You have a lime and a lineman. It's like you're hanging out, basically. It's what we call it. So I go out there, and there's a lot of kids in the area, in my area. There was a lot of young men and women in the area. And I remember we used to go out and terrorize, not terrorize, but that's a wrong word to use. We used to go out and break the curfew, basically. We used to just be out on the street for the excitement of being chased by the police. And they would, we would do other stuff. Did that come to pass? My 15th year came around, and we were now starting to go more regularly to these meetings. And the oil field workers trade union, they had meetings, and there was a couple of other organizations around the place that always kept meeting. But seeing that the village that I grew up in was based in the oil field, it was in what they call the oil belt. That village was responsible, because that was the village they found oil in first in Trinidad. And then before the real oil exploration started, so we were in the oil belt, so to speak. So there was always demonstrations and always protests and always these things. So we kind of grew up in that environment, and you haven't, you know, you hear people demanding workers' rights and all that. You know, it's like baptism. It's like a baptism. You know what I'm saying? You can't do nothing but get involved. You're involved.
Right. Born into it.
Yeah, you're kind of born into it. So around 1937, it was what we consider like a revolutionary period. And so we usually, in 1970, we would say we're grandchildren of revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And a statement which we all keep making today. We still make those statements because our grandfathers and grandparents were involved in it, and so was the other kids. So everybody knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You know, 1970 come around and all of that start happening, and the curfew and state of emergency, and then a lot of demonstrations, a lot of cultural things start happening. By cultural things start happening, I mean, meaning that we were interested in understanding what our natural culture was, because in those days you had a lot of back to Africa talk,
Mm-hmm.
East Indian and Africans unity. That was the so there's a lot of people who couldn't get with that, so to speak. You know, a lot of more people decided, well, we want to have a like socialist ideology. You know, that kind of, you know, it's a worker thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so after that period come about, as I said, a lot of demonstrations were taking place. Then the police happened to kill one brother.
Mm-hmm. During the demonstration?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that sparked off a lot of other things. But all in that, in my mind, in my personal experience, it wasn't an Islamic journey, so to speak, or lifestyle. It was more revolutionary lifestyle. It was more contemplating on oppression and equality and justice and that kind of thing.
Which is Islamic.
You see, no, which is Islamic, so to speak. But I didn't know that yet. I grew up among a lot of Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up among different religious people. In Trinidad, we celebrate each other's holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are Hindus who celebrate Ramadan, because we were invited to our neighbors who was Muslim for Eid.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Fair.
Right. So it's not like we're not accustomed or don't know anything about Islam.
Mm-hmm.
We grew, the first school I actually went to, the very first school in my life, was a Muslim school.
Mm-hmm.
It's called, from belonging to the Trinidad Muslim League. I stayed there probably a year and a half, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved in with my grandmother in the village that I grew up in, and went to a Presbyterian school. So the exposure to different religious concepts, you know, you grow up hearing different things, and
Right.
you know. I remember going to Sunday school when my parents were so-called Hindus, and my grandfather was a Sikh actually. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like a mixture of, but the seed was planted in my mind already. I remember going to Sunday school, and my mother, you know, would make sure we go to Sunday school, you know what I'm saying, and we learning about Jesus. But I never really went to the Sunday school. I went to the Sunday school, but I didn't go in the church school that I went to. The church was next door. But I would always go below the church, because it was on stilts like that. We would always go under the church and play and pitch marbles, and you know, and we would, you know, when the other kids who went